Welcome back everyone. Today we're gonna be making a mini backpack. And the finished bag measures in at 9 by 12 with a 4-inch depth, making a perfect all-around bag for traveling or just a standard day bag. The super fun thing about this bag is that you can wear it multiple ways. You can wear it crossbody, over the shoulder, or even as a backpack. I'm gonna walk you through each step in detail, so if you're new to sewing, you'll totally still be able to make this bag. And with all that being said, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna wanna grab 1 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a canvas, denim, or twill. These are all durable fabrics and very easy to work with. I'm actually gonna be using a heavier weight corduroy. This fabric is a little bit tricky to work with, but like always, feel free to use whatever fabric that's really gonna pull your design together. You'll need 1 yard for your secondary fabric, and this is gonna be a lining, so I recommend using a lighter weight cotton or polyester. We're gonna be adding a decent amount of layers together, so in the end when we're sewing the main panels together, it can get bulky if you decide to use a heavier weight fabric. You'll need 1 zipper, and this should be 20 inches or more. We're actually gonna be working off a roll. This is a super convenient way to do it that you can minimize waste, but any zipper will work with this project. Just make sure it's over the length because we are gonna be snipping the ends. You'll need 4 yards of 1-inch width webbing. Going along with that webbing, you'll need 2 strap sliders, 4 lobster clasps, and 6 D-rings. And the reason they're going along with that webbing is because you wanna match the width of your webbing to the width of your hardware. And since we're using 1-inch width webbing, you're gonna wanna grab 1-inch width hardware. You'll need 1 to 2 snap buttons. I'm gonna be using magnetic snap buttons. I use these on a lot of projects. They're super easy to install and they look really nice. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. The pattern is super easy to use. All you have to do is print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you start taping it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. After you've gathered all your supplies and your patterns printed out, it's time to move into cutting.
After taping your pattern together, it should look like this. And be sure to check your printer alignment for the best results. Cut on the outside of the black line and you should end up with 2 bottom side straps cut out of your main fabric, 1 inside pocket panel cut out of your secondary fabric on the fold, 2 bottom panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, 4 bottom side panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your lining, 2 front pocket panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, 2 top side panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, 2 pocket flat panels, both cut out of your main fabric, and lastly 4 back front panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your lining. Moving on to construction, grab both of your top side panels, place the main fabric right side up, grab your zipper, and place your zipper on the top edge with right sides together. We will be snipping the zipper ends, so I recommend using a zipper that goes past the outside edges. Place the lining panel on top, sandwiching the zipper in between the lining and the main fabric, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And after finishing up the stitch, flip the wrong sides together, lining up the main fabric and the lining, and we're gonna add a top stitch to that zipper edge. I'm using an edge presser foot to get a nice, clean, straight stitch. Grab your bottom side panels, and we're gonna place these on the edge of our top panel. Be sure to move the zipper train to the inside of the top panel. Start by placing the right sides of the lining together. Be sure to line up the correct edge. And after the lining, place the right sides of the main fabric together. Before sewing, we're gonna cut 2 5-inch strips of webbing and grab 2 D-rings. Place the webbing through the D-ring, and you can actually change the size of these if you prefer smaller or longer ones. And we're gonna place this in the center of both of the main fabric side panels. Typically, I think it's easier to leave about 1 inch to a 1/2 inch hanging off the edge. Once you have the side panels lined up and your webbing assemblies into position, you can stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This stitch can be a little bit tricky because you're going over a zipper and also webbing, so just take your time and hand crank over the zipper if you have to. Flip the wrong sides together, lining up the side seam, and we're gonna add a top stitch. And just like the previous step, it can get pretty bulky, so take your time going over those bulky areas. After stitching, we're gonna open up the panels and stitch the zipper and the webbing flush with the seam allowance. Cut 4 more strips of webbing, and these should be longer than the width of the bottom side panels. We're gonna fold the bottom side panel so just the main fabric is pointing up, and place the webbing strips evenly on top of the bottom side panel. There's a few different ways to do this. We're actually going to be creating loops so that we can clip things to the bag, and we'll be adding stitches every 2 inches, so that's just going to be 2 stitches per strip. Feel free to add more or less depending on how many loops you want to make. Also, this step is totally optional. If you don't want to add these loops to the bag, you can totally skip ahead. And lastly, stitch the outside edge. Next, I'm going to be doing another bonus step or optional step, and I'm going to be serging the outside edge and skipping the zipper. This is going to prevent fraying in the future. But before I do this, I'm going to actually snip the webbing flush with the side. Like I said, it's totally optional to add the serge. If you don't have a serger, you can either use a zigzag stitch or stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. This is also bringing all the layers together, making it easier to assemble in later steps. After serging or zigzag stitching, you can place your complete side panel off to the side. Moving on, grab both of your front pocket panels, place the right sides together, and stitch the top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the wrong sides together, and we're going to do the same exact thing as the previous step, line up the top edge and add a top stitch. After adding the top stitch, we're going to use the pattern to mark out the fold guides. And then we're going to fold out both of the placement guides and add a top stitch. And you're going to want to make these as even as possible to both of the outside edges because this is going to actually create a little bit of depth in that front pocket. Grab one back front pocket panel to reference, place the pocket on top, and as you can see it goes past the outside edges, so we're going to use the pattern and pinch the bottom edge so it lines up with the outside edges of the front back panel. When you get the edges lined up, place a pin on the bottom edge where the fabric folds. Take the pocket panel off the front back panel and add a tack stitch. And that's going to be our kind of makeshift pleat. Moving on, grab the back front panel. Using the placement guide, we're going to place the pocket, line it up with the bottom and side edges, and we're going to add a stitch to secure it down, but make sure you stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. After stitching, we're going to grab the pattern again and mark out our webbing handle placement. And I think the easiest way to do this is to actually cut out the rectangles on the pattern and then place that pattern on your panel and trace it with chalk. You want these as even as possible, and from here we're going to grab 20-inch strips of webbing, and these can be adjusted to personal preference. What we're doing is placing them on the guides and rolling over the ends. Before we stitch them down, we're actually going to be modifying the strips to look more like handles. If you choose to do this step, we're just going to be doing the center of the handle, so start about 5 inches in from the ends and roll it over so the wrong sides of the webbing are touching, and we're going to stitch it directly on that outside edge. For the best results, I highly recommend using the same color thread as the webbing. This is going to hide any little imperfections and make it look more like an entire whole strap. At this point, you can see the height of the handle, so feel free to make adjustments. Next, we're going to install them to our panels. So we're going to roll the ends over and line it up within our webbing placement guides. When it comes to stitching these down, you have a few different options. First, we're going to stitch the outside edge. This is the most basic way to do it. Just do a regular straight stitch around the outside edge as close as you can to that edge. This is a great way to do it, but it's very hard to get a perfect rectangle. The second technique is using a zigzag stitch and going back and forth and making a nice thick line. This will give extra strength to the handle, but it's also a little bit easier to get a more professional looking stitch. The last thing I'm going to do is add double-sided rivets to both of the handles. I'm adding 2 to each strap end, and yeah, this is a little bit over the top, but this is not really for strength and durability, it's actually for a nice little detail look. And feel free to use whatever technique that works best for you. Moving on, grab your pocket flap panels, place the right sides together, and we're going to stitch just the bottom edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so leave that top edge unstitched. After completing the stitch, we're going to flip the right side out, lining up that bottom edge. I like to place a few pins to make sure it's perfectly lined up, and from here we're going to add a top stitch. The next step is optional. If you're using a fabric that frays a lot, what we're going to do is serge that top edge to prevent future fraying. Using the pattern piece, we're going to cut out the hole for the button placement and mark that on our panel. Using scissors, I'm going to cut out a small hole, or feel free to use a punch. Grab a closure of your choice. I'm using a magnetic closure, so I'm going to start by using the thinner side. Place the closure in your hole from the back side of the flap panel, grab the closure cap and place it on the back. Next, we're going to secure the closure down by pressing it. And feel free to use a press, hammer die, or pliers. And it's really that easy to add a magnetic closure. Moving on, we're going to place that pocket flap panel on our main front panel. This will be our back front panel with the pocket. Line it up in between the pocket and the webbing, and we're going to flip it over the horizontal axis and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the flap back down and add a top stitch to that top edge. And it can get pretty thick, so definitely just take your time. After top stitching, we're going to add the second part of our closure, and this is easily done by just marking where the top part of the closure lands, marking it with chalk, cutting out our hole, grabbing the opposite end of the closure, placing it from the right side of our fabric, adding the back, and pressing it into position. After pressing it down, I always like to double check to make sure that everything lines up, so just flip it up and down a few times, and if it's good to go, you can move it off to the side, grab the lining panel and 1/4 inch foam, and this is going to be a foam insert, so if you do not want to add this, you can totally do the next steps without the foam, but this foam is going to give a little bit of structure to the bag. So place the foam on the wrong side of the lining and make sure it does not touch any of the outside edges. Place the wrong side of the main fabric on top, and we're going to stitch around the outside edge using the serger or a zigzag stitch. If you don't have either, you can use just a regular straight stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. In this step, we are mending all these layers together, so it's a little bit easier to sew in future steps. And after sewing all the layers together, you can kind of see that it's acting more like a front fold panel that's going to have a little bit of protection for whatever you're carrying on the inside. Moving on, we're going to do the same exact thing for the opposite front back panel. So place your foam insert on your lining, place the wrong sides together, and sew all the way around the outside edge. With all the layers sewn together, you can place it off to the side and grab your bottom panel. We're going to repeat the previous steps, so place your foam in between the lining and the main fabric and stitch all the way around the outside edge. The fun thing about this technique is that you can actually apply this to any of your bag patterns, and it's going to add a little bit of protection. From here, you can place the main bottom panel off to the side and grab your bottom side strap panels. Flip the wrong side up and fold the bottom edge along the hem guides. Fold the wrong sides together on the center fold, lining up the diagonal edges, cut 2 4-inch strips of webbing, place the webbing through your D-ring, and lastly place the assembly on the inside of your folded strap panel. And feel free to adjust how much it sticks out of your panel. With the webbing sandwiched in between the panel, we're going to stitch the outside edge as close as we can to the edge, and make sure you stitch on top of that webbing. We're also going to be adding a diagonal stitch going across that webbing as well for extra strength. You want to make sure that these can support whatever you put in the bag. Place the strap panels off to the side, and we're going to cut 2 1-yard strips of webbing. Grab all 4 of your lobster clasps. We're going to be working on 2 separate straps. Slide the clasp onto each strap, and then we're going to roll the end over twice and add a tack stitch. Repeat this process for both of our straps, and we're going to move to the opposite end of the strap. Grab both of our strap sliders, and we're going to slide them on about a foot down the strap. Feed the last 2 lobster clasps on our strap, pull a little bit of slack out of our strap sliders, take the webbing end, and we're going to feed it back through the strap slider from the outside opening back down through the inside opening. Roll the end over once to hide that raw edge and add a tack stitch. Repeat this exact process for the opposite strap, and both of your straps are complete. I really like making super simple straps like this because you can really personalize them to your exact measurements, but from here, place the straps off to the side, cut another 2 5-inch strips of webbing, feed both of them through your D-rings, grab your front back panel, and we're going to place them on the top edge on the inside of your handle. Grab the complete bottom strap and place it about a 1/2 inch from the bottom edge. Be sure to evenly line them up with one another so the bag sits nice and even on your back. With everything lined up, we're going to stitch as close as we can to the outside edge, securing everything down. Place it off to the side and grab our inside pocket panel. Mark out the foam insert guides, make sure the panel is folded with right sides together, place the foam insert on the inside of your stitch guides, pin everything down and stitch on your marked lines. Be sure not to stitch on your foam insert itself. And after stitching, we're going to clean up the outside edges by serging. Feel free to serge or add a zigzag stitch. The fabric I'm using frays a lot, so I really like to clean these edges up when I can. Grab the front back panel, place the lining up, and we're going to place that pocket on the bottom edge. And we're going to do the same thing as the front pocket. We're going to pull the sides in to match the sides of the main panel, creating a pleat at the bottom edge of our inside pocket. Once you have everything lined up, we're going to stitch around the outside edge as close as we can to that edge. After stitching, just double check to make sure all the layers got sewn together, and you can move this panel off to the side. Grab the complete front panel and our complete side panel, mark out the centers on both of these panels, be sure to fold the handle down, and we're going to place the right sides together, lining the center of the zipper up with the center of the top. And I highly recommend pinning it into place, and once you have it lined up and pinned down, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around that edge. This is a step you really want to take your time because this is going to be the alignment of your entire bag, so just take your time, and once you get done stitching, flip it out, make sure all the layers got stitched together. If everything is looking good, flip the inside back out. Grab your complete front back panel. Just like the front, we're going to line up the centers with right sides together. Pin and stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you get done and it's not lined up, I highly recommend dethreading and trying again. This is a tough stitch and it's very hard to get it right your first try. After sewing, snip the webbing ends flush with the seam allowance. Flip the right sides out to double check that all the layers got stitched together. And from here, you can actually start to see the bag come together. The next step is optional, so we're going to flip the inside back out and add bias tape to the inside edges. I'm going to run you through a few different techniques that you can use to really take your project to the next level. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags. I highly recommend using this option, but like always, feel free to use whatever technique that works best for you. After adding bias tape to both of the inside seams, we're going to grab our bottom panel and place it on our bottom opening with right sides together. Pin the panel into position and stitch around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I will say this is the trickiest one out of all of them because you're going to be stitching around the corners. So when you approach one of these corners, you kind of just want to keep sewing and turn the bag as you're sewing, and it should turn out totally fine. And lastly, add bias tape to the bottom edge. Flip the right side out and your bag is almost complete. Add your straps to whatever D-rings you plan on using. You can either use the sides or the back like a backpack. I also use a leather strip and a magnetic closure to make a nice little holder at the top of my handle. You can do the same thing or even make it out of webbing. This is going to hold the handle together at the top so they're not flapping all around. And lastly, added my branding that also doubles up as clip loops.
And there you have it, your mini backpack is complete. Thank you so much for watching the channel. And it definitely takes a few tries to really perfect these bags. There's a lot of different intricate steps that if you mess up one slightly, it will totally throw off the entire bag. But like anything, just keep trying and eventually you're gonna get those bags looking really nice. But like always, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.